7 words. That's all it took to send global financial markets into complete chaos this afternoon. 7 words spoken by a man who spent his entire career inside the world's most powerful central banks, and who knew exactly which pressure point would cause maximum damage to the United States economy. I've covered financial crises before. I've reported on market crashes, currency collapses, and economic confrontations between nations, but I have never seen anything like what unfolded today between two countries that have been allies for over a century. What started as a dispute over energy policy has now escalated into something that could fundamentally reshape the global financial order. And the most remarkable part is that almost nobody saw it coming, except perhaps one man who had been quietly preparing for this moment for weeks. This afternoon, the world witnessed something unprecedented in modern financial history. The United States government deployed its most powerful economic weapon against Canada, a NATO ally, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, and America's single largest trading partner. Within hours, Canada responded with a counterstrike that targeted the most vulnerable point in the American financial system. The response was so precise, so devastating, and so expertly crafted that it immediately raised a question that every central bank governor on the planet is now asking themselves tonight. If this could happen to Canada, the closest ally the United States has ever had, what would stop it from happening to anyone else? The implications of that question could reshape the international monetary system for generations. I want to walk you through exactly what happened today because the details matter enormously. At 3:12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the White House released a statement announcing that the president had signed an executive order imposing immediate financial restrictions on Canadian banking institutions operating within the United States. The order freezes all correspondent banking relationships between the 6 largest Canadian banks and their American counterparts. Effective at midnight tonight, the White House described this as a necessary measure to protect American financial sovereignty and to respond to what the administration called Canada's weaponization of energy policy against the United States. The statement claimed that Canada's refusal to guarantee energy exports had created an unacceptable national security risk. It said the United States would use every tool available to ensure that Canada understood the consequences of its decisions, and it expressed confidence that the Canadian Prime Minister would reconsider his position once the financial reality set in. Less than 2 hours later, at 5:08 p.m., Mark Carney held a press conference in Ottawa. He stood at the podium, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly into the camera. What he said next will be studied in economics courses for decades to come. Canada will now sell its U.S. Treasury holdings. Those 7 words represent the most dangerous financial escalation between two allied nations since the Second World War. Canada just threatened to dump over $300 billion in United States Treasury securities onto the open market. In doing so, Canada has weaponized the one thing the United States never expected a close ally to touch: America's debt. The bond markets reacted within minutes. Currency deaths went into immediate crisis mode, and every central bank that holds significant U.S. dollar reserves began placing urgent calls to their counterparts around the world. I'm going to take you through every aspect of this crisis, from the details of the executive order to the market reaction, to the 3 possible scenarios for how this financial war could unfold. What you're about to hear is the most significant confrontation between allied nations in the post-war era, and it happened today. Let me walk you through what this executive order actually does, because the details reveal the full scope of what Washington decided to unleash against Canada. According to the signed document, which was posted on the White House website this afternoon, the Treasury Department is directed to suspend all correspondent banking relationships between U.S. financial institutions and the 6 largest Canadian banks. These banks collectively hold approximately $4.88 trillion in assets and operate extensive networks within the United States. One of these banks alone operates over branches across the American East Coast and holds more U.S. retail deposits than many mid-sized American banks. The scale of this order is difficult to overstate. Starting at midnight tonight, these Canadian banks cannot clear U.S. dollar transactions through American banks. They cannot settle trades in U.S. markets. They cannot process wire transfers through the U.S. financial system. For American customers who bank with these institutions, this means their accounts are effectively frozen. They cannot withdraw funds, make payments, or transfer money until the order is lifted or the bank separates its American operations from its Canadian parent company. We are talking about millions of American citizens in states like New York, New Jersey, Florida, and Connecticut who will wake up tomorrow morning unable to access their own money. Not because they did anything wrong, not because their bank is insolvent, not because of any financial crisis, but because of a political dispute between two governments over energy policy. The executive order also directs the Securities and Exchange Commission to review all Canadian bank listings on U.S. stock exchanges and to consider suspending trading in Canadian bank securities if there is evidence that Canadian government policy poses systemic risk to U.S. financial markets. This is the kind of language normally reserved for hostile nations, not for treaty allies. According to sources present in the Oval Office during the discussions leading up to this order, the president told his advisors that this action would bring Canada to its knees within 48 hours. The reasoning was straightforward. Canada's economy is deeply integrated into the U.S. dollar system. Canadian banks clear roughly $400 billion in U.S. dollar transactions every month. Cutting them off would paralyze Canadian commerce, Canadian trade, and Canadian financial markets. The White House calculated that the financial pain would be asymmetric. Canada needs the dollar system more than the dollar system needs Canada. Once their banks were cut off, the logic went, the Canadian Prime Minister would have no choice but to call and beg for a deal. It was a calculation based on raw financial power. The United States controls the dollar system. The dollar system is the backbone of international finance. Therefore, anyone who depends on that system can be brought to heel by threatening to remove their access. What the White House did not calculate, however, was who they were picking this fight with. Mark Carney is not a typical politician who stumbled into economic policy through a career in law or public relations. He is arguably the most qualified financial crisis manager currently leading any government on earth. He spent an entire decade running central banks during some of the most turbulent periods in modern financial history. He managed the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis, during which Canada was the only G7 nation whose banking system did not require a government bailout. He then ran the Bank of England through Brexit, managing currency crisis and market panic in real time while maintaining financial stability. He served as a special envoy, working directly with sovereign wealth funds and central banks across the globe. When the White House decided to weaponize the financial system against Canada, they picked a fight with a man who has spent his entire career inside that system. He understands its pressure points better than anyone in Washington, and he knows exactly where the vulnerabilities are. At 5:08 p.m., Carney walked to the podium in Ottawa and delivered a response that will be analyzed by financial historians for years to come. He began by describing what the United States had done in precise clinical terms. He noted that no American president has ever used financial sanctions against a NATO ally, a Five Eyes partner, and America's largest trading partner. He made clear that the United States had weaponized the dollar system against Canada, the same tool America uses against Iran, against North Korea, against countries it considers adversaries. And then he said something that framed the entire confrontation in terms the world could understand. The president has decided to treat Canada as an enemy. Carney emphasized that Canada did not seek this confrontation. Canada simply rejected a proposal that would have surrendered Canadian sovereignty over natural resources. That rejection, he noted, was Canada's right as a sovereign nation. The American response was to attack Canada's banking system, freeze accounts of millions of Canadians and Americans, and attempt to collapse Canadian financial markets. Then Carney laid out Canada's response, and this is where the true sophistication of his strategy became apparent. First, effective immediately, the Bank of Canada activated emergency swap lines with the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, and the People's Bank of China. These swap lines allow Canadian banks to continue clearing international transactions in euros, yen, pounds, and yuan without requiring access to the U.S. dollar system. In a single announcement, Carney neutralized the primary weapon the United States had deployed against Canada. Canadian commerce would not stop. Canadian banks would continue to function. The United States had removed itself from the equation, and Canada would operate without it. The press room fell silent as reporters processed what they were hearing. Then came the second part of the response. Carney announced that the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which manages $570 billion in assets, would begin an immediate review of its U.S. Treasury holdings. Canada currently holds approximately $319 billion in U.S. government securities. The pension board had been instructed to prepare for an orderly sale of these holdings over the next 90 days. The proceeds would be reinvested in European sovereign bonds, Japanese government bonds, and gold reserves. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Carney held up his hand and continued with a detailed explanation of what this meant. If Canada sells $319 billion in Treasury securities onto the open market, it will increase U.S. borrowing costs. It will push U.S. interest rates higher. It will weaken the U.S. dollar, and it will send a signal to every other country holding U.S. debt that the United States is willing to weaponize its financial system against its closest allies. Every central bank in the world, Carney said, will ask themselves the same question tonight. If America did this to Canada, what would stop them from doing it to us? Carney then revealed something that made the Treasury Department's phone start ringing immediately. He announced that he had spoken that afternoon with the governors of the central banks of Japan, Europe, the United Kingdom, and China. All four had expressed serious concern about the United States' decision to weaponize banking access against a treaty ally. All four had agreed to activate emergency liquidity arrangements with Canada, and all four had indicated that their respective institutions would review their own U.S. dollar reserve allocations in light of the day's events. Canada, Carney emphasized, is not alone. The international financial community is watching, and it is alarmed. This was not a panicked reaction from a leader caught off guard. This was a coordinated, pre-positioned response from someone who had anticipated this scenario and prepared for it weeks in advance. The market reaction to Carney's statement was immediate and severe. Within 20 minutes, the U.S. dollar index dropped 3.1%, marking its largest single-session decline in over a decade. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note spiked from 4.38% to 4.91%, as traders priced in the possibility that $319 billion in Canadian-held treasuries would flood the market. The 30-year Treasury yield crossed 5.2%, 2%. For ordinary Americans, these numbers translate into real costs that will affect their daily lives. Mortgage rates, which are tied to long-term Treasury yields, are projected to increase by a full percentage point within days if the selling begins. That means the average American mortgage payment would increase by roughly $340 per month. For a family already stretched by inflation and high housing costs, this could be the difference between keeping their home and losing it. This is not abstract financial theory. This is the direct consequence of weaponizing the financial system against an ally who knew exactly how to strike back. U.S. bank stocks collapse in the aftermath of the announcement. Major American financial institutions saw their share prices drop between 8 and 11% in a matter of minutes. Markets are pricing in the risk that a U.S.-Canada financial war could trigger broader instability in the global dollar system. Meanwhile, gold surged $127 per ounce, hitting an all-time high as investors fled to safe haven assets. The message from markets is unmistakable. Carney's threat is credible, and the consequences of following through would be devastating for the United States. What makes Carney's response so strategically significant is not just the Treasury threat, but the swap line network he activated. These arrangements mean that Canadian banks can continue operating in international markets without the U.S. dollar. They can settle trade in euros, yen, pounds, and yuan. They can clear transactions, process payments, and maintain liquidity. The U.S. banking freeze was designed to paralyze Canada's financial system. The swap lines neutralize that weapon almost entirely. According to sources familiar with the Bank of Canada's preparations, these arrangements were not negotiated today. They have been in preparation for weeks. Carney saw the possibility of financial escalation coming and prepositioned Canada's defenses before the executive order was ever signed. This is the difference between a leader who understands financial systems at their deepest level and a leader who views financial systems simply as tools of coercion. But there is another dimension to this crisis that has created an immediate humanitarian problem on American soil. The executive order affects a bank that operates over Sowers branches across 15 U.S. states and holds approximately $380 billion in deposits from American customers. Starting at midnight tonight, those customers cannot access their money. They cannot make mortgage payments, pay bills, withdraw cash, or transfer funds. The FDIC has issued an emergency statement saying it is monitoring the situation, but has not yet determined whether these U.S. operations fall under federal deposit insurance protections given the unusual circumstances. Legal experts say this is completely uncharted territory. No president has ever frozen the operations of a solvent foreign bank operating legally in the United States. Lawsuits are expected to be filed by tomorrow morning. State attorneys general across the eastern seaboard have already announced they are reviewing the executive order's legality. Elected officials in affected states have issued furious statements pointing out that millions of their constituents who have done nothing wrong will be unable to access their money because of a political dispute with Canada. The political fallout from this decision has not even begun to materialize, but it is coming. The most dangerous element of Carney's statement was not about Canada's Treasury sales. It was about what those sales signal to every other country in the world. The U.S. dollar's status as the global reserve currency depends on one critical assumption that the United States will not weaponize dollar access against countries that are playing by the rules. The U.S. has imposed financial sanctions before, but always against countries that violated international norms. Iran developed nuclear weapons capabilities. North Korea threatened regional stability. Russia invaded Ukraine. Canada has violated no international norms. Canada simply refused to sign an energy agreement, and in response, the United States cut Canada off from the dollar system. Every central bank governor in the world is tonight asking exactly the question Carney predicted. If America did this to Canada, what stops them from doing it to us? According to sources at the Bank for International Settlements, at least 7 central banks have already requested emergency consultations about accelerating their diversification away from U.S. dollar reserves. If even a fraction of global dollar reserves are redirected to euros, yen, or gold, the impact on U.S. borrowing costs and U.S. economic power would be generational in scope. The United States borrows $2 trillion per year. That borrowing depends on foreign demand for U.S. Treasury securities. If that demand drops, interest rates rise, the deficit becomes more expensive to finance, and America's ability to project economic power diminishes permanently. Carney understands this dynamic intimately. He spent his career managing reserve currencies. He knows that the dollar's power comes from trust, and that this executive order just shattered that trust with America's closest ally in front of the entire world. Let me give you 3 possible scenarios for how this crisis could unfold from here, because the range of outcomes is extraordinarily wide. In the first scenario, a rapid de-escalation, the legal and political fallout from frozen bank accounts forces the White House to reverse the executive order within 48 hours. Millions of American voters in swing states cannot access their bank accounts. Congressional pressure becomes overwhelming. The order is rescinded with claims that it achieved its purpose. Canada suspends the Treasury sales but does not reverse its swap line arrangements. The structural damage is already done. Canada now has a permanent financial infrastructure that operates independently of the U.S. dollar system. Other countries accelerate their own diversification quietly. The dollar remains dominant, but its monopoly begins to crack. In the second scenario, the president refuses to back down, and Canada begins selling U.S. Treasury securities in tranches of $30 billion per week. The 10-year yield hits 5.5% within a month. Mortgage rates cross 8.5%. The U.S. housing market freezes. Stock markets enter a bear market as higher borrowing costs crush corporate valuations. The Federal Reserve is forced to intervene, buying treasuries to stabilize yields, effectively printing money to absorb the bonds Canada is selling. Inflation spikes, the dollar weakens further, and the political battle over the president's authority to impose such sanctions becomes the defining confrontation of the year. In the third scenario, Canada's swap line network with Europe, Japan, the United Kingdom, and China becomes a permanent alternative clearing system. Canadian energy exports are settled in euros and yuan rather than dollars. Other resource exporting nations observe Canada's success and begin negotiating their own non-dollar arrangements. Within 18 months, the share of global trade settled in US dollars dropped significantly. The dollar remains the largest reserve currency but is no longer dominant. US borrowing costs increase permanently. The era of American financial hegemony does not end with a crash. It ends with a slow, irreversible migration to a multipolar financial system triggered by an American president who decided to sanction Canada. The dollar's power was never guaranteed by military force or economic size alone. It was guaranteed by trust, the trust that the United States would not arbitrarily cut off allied nations from the financial system. That trust is now broken, and a central banker who became prime minister just showed the world exactly what happens when you break